Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we are going to once again be doing a list of every album worst to best for the band Megadeth. I do want to say in advance, this is clearly my favorite band of all time. I am incredibly biased, and on top of that I am going to have some incredibly hot takes in this video, but understand that all of this is coming from a place of love. This is of course just my opinion. I would love to see your opinions in the comments below, but just know that I have listened to these albums literally hundreds, if not thousands of times. Alright, so let's get into it then. The worst Megadeth album is Super Collider. It's 2013. Megadeth has just finished their contract with Roadrunner Records. They're coming down from their last album, 13, a record which was not really groundbreaking, but got enough attention to support a comeback of the legendary Gigantor, albeit in a reduced form. Anyway, on top of coming off of those things, Dave has had some mounting problems with his voice that have only become more apparent at this point. After some spinal surgeries that he received in 2011 to treat stenosis, these problems became much more obvious. Also at this point, the band has had one of its longest stable lineups, with the exception of James Lomenzo leaving the band for David Ellefson to return to the fold, but Sean Drover and Chris Broderick at this point have been with the band for like 7 or 8 years. So there's a lot of elements coming together for this album. Megadeth have been putting out an album like every 2 or 3 years for the better part of a decade. Their writing is starting to become pretty spotty. The pressure is mounting to deliver an album, and a good album at that. If I remember right, the lead up for this album was a pretty big affair. There was a decent amount of hype for this one. There were lots of little studio clips coming out and excitement about a new direction in sound with the band's departure from Roadrunner Records. Then the single for the title track, Super Collider, came out. And it was a really weird moment because Megadeth had been maintaining a pretty heavy sound for a while. Not anything that was too inaccessible, mind you, but they had definitely been focusing on their thrash roots. So the single comes out, and I remember multiple people compared it to like Life is a Highway, and this song comes out, and that was the first moment that that's really when I became afraid. So the day comes, May 31st, 2013, I pirate the album. At this point I was probably 14 years old. I didn't have any money, but I knew my birthday was coming up, so I knew someone would buy me a copy of the album anyway, and I did receive 2 copies. Anyway, the album comes out, and man, it's just awful. Past the opening track, Kingmaker, which is a blatant Children of the Grave ripoff, this album sounds like a collection of unfinished ideas and pieces of riffs loosely tacked onto one another. Plus, Mustaine is still struggling to hit notes he no longer can at this point. The general lyricism is at its worst it's ever been, on top of the vocals, so that the entire end of that spectrum is just absolutely abysmal. I think the track Burn specifically still sticks with me as one of the most forced choruses I've ever heard. Built for War has this awful, like, tough guy groove metal thing that I still don't really understand the appeal of. And really the only song that's somewhat worthwhile here is the cover of Thin Lizzy's Cold Sweat, which is actually pretty good. I do also find the track The Blackest Crow to be very close to being a decent song with its brooding banjo and somewhat decent lyrics. I also think one of the worst moments happens on Dance in the Rain with this incredibly forced inclusion of Disturbed's David Draymond. I think at this point he was touring with his side project Device and was really trying a lot of stuff outside of Disturbed. Anyway, his feature here is produced horribly, and I don't really like his vocals in general, but you can tell he's kind of just doing what he can here. The lyrics he has are pretty bad. I genuinely dislike most material from Disturbed, but I can really sympathize with the guy for putting in the work and it being turned out, well, turning out this bad, frankly. Anyway, that is, in my opinion, the worst Megadeth record. Next, I think, would be the album before Super Collider. 2011's 13 is our next big stinker. I actually think that there's some great tracks on this album, but like I said earlier, Megadeth were running out of ideas at this point, re-recording not 1, but 2 tracks from their back catalog to include on this release. Those tracks being New World Order and Millennium of the Blind, both of which came out of the Euthanasia era of the mid-90s. And mind you, while Dave's voice is starting to become kind of weak at this point, it's really not awful, plus Dave's lyrics haven't become nearly as blunt at this point, with some lines that are still pretty cool. But you can really start seeing some of the cracks in the armor here. This is the beginning of Megadeth really heavily leaning on like chugging as a default delivery for the rhythm section of the guitars. On top of that, right about halfway through this album, the track quality dips very quickly, very dramatically, and while I can't say that the first half of the album is the strongest material, there are a couple of pretty good songs, namely Sudden Death and Public Enemy #1. Tracks like Fastlane and Wrecker are some of the worst in the Megadeth catalog, Fastlane just being a rehash of 1320, a track off of their previous album Endgame, and Wrecker featuring some of the most awkward lyric delivery I've ever heard. And while I love the track Black Swan, it again is a rehash and re-recording as it was a Japanese bonus track for 2007's United Abominations. So yeah, there's a pretty glaring amount of writing on the wall at this point in their discography that things are not going in a very strong direction. Okay, this is where some of the more hot takes start dropping. The third worst Megadeth album is 2016's Grammy Award-winning Dystopia. On release, I think I really did enjoy this album, but in reality, it was mostly because I just wanted to love it. Megadeth has a modern return to form, and really its best moments are just kind of okay. Honestly, the fact that Megadeth won a Grammy for Dystopia is kind of mind-blowing. Not that they shouldn't have won a Grammy, but this song simply doesn't really deserve it. It's mostly mediocre when compared to material that was actually of a higher caliber that did deserve a Grammy. Though I think that says more about the Academy than it does the song. Anyway, this album has a fairly average, somewhat flat mix. The best songs on the album are mid-tier at best, generally with the exception of Fatal Illusion, which actually is one of the best later era Megadeth songs. Death From Within is pretty decent but tends to trip over its uncreative chugging. In fact, that's a pretty common theme on this album. Almost every song here at some point seems to be incredibly guilty of this. Poisonous Shadows is a pretty cool change-up for the album that kind of reminds me of like the second half of the track The Hardest Part of Letting Go, Sealed with a Kiss off of Endgame. It does leave a bit to desire though, as the bulk of the song is really stretched out over its 6-minute runtime and there's not really much to show for it. At the very least, the covers of Foreign Policy and Melt the Ice Away are pretty decent. This album is also the first sign of improvement in Dave's voice in a long time. It just seems that like embracing the new lower register and tuning down to D standard really did a lot for the vocals on this album. Dave still sounds like he's straining his voice at a lot of points on this album, but it's far less prevalent than it was on Super Collider. Okay, I think next up I'm going with 2001's The World Needs a Hero. This album is the first to me to feel like a victim of the late 90s and early 2000s production, and it is really the first victim of the so-called return to form after 1999's Risk. And there definitely was a lot of pressure for this album to be good. People really disliked Risk, and for mostly good reasons too, but this attempt at a return to form mostly comes across as awkward, blending a much more blunt instrumental writing style with Dave's, at this point, fairly good vocals. And this is one of the rare times where I feel like a Megadeth album is incredibly middle and bottom heavy. I mean, the first track, Disconnect, feels like they're playing it safe. It's a very, very by the books for this era sound. The title track is pretty decent, but ends up being the victim of some pretty bad sample work that kind of works in a way, but feels out of place most of the time. Plus, Dave is still kind of blending some like Risk era oohs and ahs and grunts into the mix, which don't really work with this attempt to move away from that sound and kind of like recapture some of the heaviness. It just kind of sounds goofy. Moto Psycho genuinely seems like it's just kind of an odd song with some generally bad lyrics. It's almost kind of a callback to Have Cool Will Travel off of Cryptic Writings, but a little bit more cool and like, you know, hey, I liked this song for a long time, but I mean, you know, I don't really dislike it now, but it's definitely a bit dated. And I think one of the worst tracks here is 1000 Times Goodbye, which is solely because of the really weird sampled-in phone conversations between Dave Mustaine, and I think they're using his wife for this recording, where there's this like really badly acted out cheating argument that takes up like way too much of the song, plus the final line from Dave before the guitar solo kind of ruins what actually is a great solo with just how goofy the delivery is. He ends the argument where his wife or girlfriend admits to cheating on him with this incredibly silly, "You know what? You suck." And I don't really know what the logic behind using this line was, but I feel like the only excuse would have been to like avoid a parental advisory sticker, but that seems so odd for 2001. Like, they really should have just ripped into it for this sample. If they were gonna lean into that phone call, it should have been like way more fucked up at the end. From here on out though, there is a pretty dramatic increase in quality. I think some of the best Megadeth deep cuts are on this album. Burning Bridges, Recipe for Hate, Warhorse, Losing My Senses, Return to Hangar, When. These are all legitimately excellent songs. Obviously, Dread and the Fugitive Mind is probably the best track on the album, but there's some really cool stuff here if you spend some time with these tracks. I even think Promises is a pretty good ballad despite feeling a little bit dated. This song specifically is trying some weirder stuff for this band, and while I can't say it's doing the best every time, I like the approach and I like the effort. Okay guys, this is it. This is the hot take that you've been waiting for, and I know you've been wondering when I was going to mention it, but Risk is a better album than all of the previous albums I've discussed. And there is a caveat, of course. I'm talking about the original 1999 release, not the 2004 remaster, and you might not even realize this, but there is a massive difference between the two. The 2004 remaster takes what is generally a very cohesive album with a very distinct sound and rips out some of the most well thought out and important parts from that mix. I would say 90% of the people who think this album is awful have been swayed that way because for a very long time now, the easiest version of this album to get your hands on has been the 2004 version. And I know that this is a really big claim, but just listen to the original 1999 mix and tell me what you think, because I'm certain that it is better than you remember. Yes, it is a very different album from Megadeth. Some may argue it would have made more sense as a Dave Mustaine solo project, but personally, I think the way that this album came together made sense for this era of the band. There's a point where you really have to choose between stagnation and innovation, and while I wouldn't call Risk innovative, it certainly was not afraid to try a few things. When talking about these songs, I will be referring to the 1999 mix. Keep that in mind. Insomnia, while not maybe the most creative lyrically, has an incredibly catchy and punchy structure. This song sounds huge, and honestly, it is one of my favorite things about this record. The mixes are incredibly full, even with these simpler song structures. Prince of Darkness is the same story. I think most would consider this the best track off of this album. It certainly has some of the most distinctive vocal lines that Dave has ever delivered. This to me indicates the peak of Mustaine's vocal abilities, and while the decline after Risk would not happen immediately, there's a very clear peak that is reached on this album. While on paper too, I'm not really the biggest fan of a song like Crush 'Em, but I actually still really like this track. It's a really dumb song, admittedly, but despite that, the lyrics, weren't even written by Mustaine or anyone else in the band, but I still think that this is a pretty fun song. I think the only songs that I really dislike on this one are Ecstasy and Seven, both of which just kind of get a little into a weirdly over-the-top pop groove. As for all of the other tracks, though, I think there's a lot of merit to songs like Breadline, I'll Be There, and even Wanderlust, a track that I actually think might be one of the best deep cuts in the entire Megadeth catalog. I do also like The Doctor Is Calling to an extent. I think the intro samples are a little bit weak, though at least on this album, whoever was doing the mixing tried to apply some industrial style flares on how these samples sounded. They're pretty decently layered into the tracks instead of sitting right on the top, so that's pretty good. I also think Time the Beginning is pretty good. Time the End is also fine, but I feel like they very easily could have combined both of the songs, as both of these tracks are 2 or 3 minutes and some change. Okay, we're into the top 10. We are rounding the corner into a little bit more of a higher quality area. We're raising the bar. The next album on my list is 2009's Endgame. This album, I think most fans would call the band's most successful attempt at recapturing what made the band so good in the first place. This isn't necessarily the best vocal work from Dave, but it is some of the best songwriting for the modern era of Megadeth. Dialectic Chaos into This Day We Fight is an incredibly tight set of album openers, and I personally think that This Day We Fight is one of the best tracks in the late era Megadeth catalog, and is certainly one of the best on the album. 44 minutes and 13:20, while not my favorites, are still very catchy and very reminiscent of the early to mid-90s material. Actually, a lot of the most solid tracks on the album tend to be right in line with the material off of Countdown to Extinction, with a newer, more keen edge. The title track Endgame, while lyrically is a bit of a Alex Jones conspiracy level track, is still a sick song. The hardest part of Letting Go has a somewhat weak intro, but has a really cool second section which has some great dramatic string work. How the Story Ends and The Right to Go Insane are some of the best callback tracks on the album, both feeling a bit like Countdown outtakes. And I think when this album came out, I wasn't really sure what to make of it. I remember going down to my local FYE when that was still a much larger chain, picking up this album and just kind of looking over everything. Dave was starting to look kind of haggard at this point, but the songs were clean, crisp, and cohesive. And I hadn't really devoured their catalog as much at that point, so I listened to it a few times and kind of put it down for a while, but I did eventually come back around to it, and I'm glad I did because there are some really great gems here. Okay, so on to the next album. We are back into the late 90s with 1997's Cryptic Writings. This album would be the peak of their commercial viability before the relative bomb that was Risk. Cryptic Writings would see the band at their most melodic, and in a way, it would also see them in their most hard rock-focused era. This is also notably the last album with all of the main 90s lineup together. Not soon after this album, in 1998, Nick Menza would depart the band, thus ending the mighty 90s lineup. This album to me really is the culmination of a push to commercialize, mixed with a very sure identity that was Megadeth at this point. There's a really clear goal in mind for this album. This is the logical endpoint quality-wise past the style that Euthanasia brought to the table. And this album is stacked with some excellent material, certainly not thrash metal, but excellent rock songs songs nonetheless. The mega hit Trust, tracks like Almost Honest, Use the Man, I'll Get Even, She-Wolf, all excellent songs in their own right. And the other tracks on this album hold their own too, with moments where the band's roots shine through on tracks like Vortex or Fight for Freedom, both songs that I would view as weaker songs for this album, but those elements are still brought to the table. Anyway, I think this is one of the most transitory albums for this band. It certainly is the end of an era with the departure of Nick Menza after this album, but it's got a very distinct sound that I think is very well done. Okay, so we've made it to the middle of the list, and so right smack dab in the middle of this list is 2004's The System Has Failed. This is the comeback album that no one saw coming. In 2002, Dave Mustaine fell asleep with his arm over the back of a chair and pinched one of his nerves and was told that he would never play guitar again. But here we are 2 years later, he's putting another album together. And I think that initially this is supposed to be a solo album, but Megadeth was still contractually obligated to release another album underneath the Sanctuary Records label, thus the return to the Megadeth name. Anyway, admittedly, when I first heard this album, I did not like it. I thought it was incredibly weak, but I was hell-bent on enjoying as much material from these guys as I could because I simply could not get enough. So what I did was I played it on loop on my iPod for like 4 months. I absolutely love this album. And no, it's not their best work, but there's so much stuff on this album that is isolated to this record. This, to me, is a perfect blend of that late 90s melodic approach that the band had been riding with since Euthanasia, and a fresh, new, revitalized thrash metal revival thing. And while most of the songs here don't quite fall under the thrash metal banner, there's a lot of that DNA in this album. There's tracks like the opener, Blackmail the Universe, and songs like Kick the Chair that absolutely land as competent, well-written thrash tracks, and where it doesn't feel like that, it feels like hard rock with extraordinarily complicated jazzy solos from none other than Chris Poland, the band's original studio guitar player, who makes a return here for session work. I think that my favorite tracks here are probably Kick the Chair, Something That I'm Not, Of Mice and Men, and My Kingdom. I just love the fact that there are so many weird production choices here that are unique to this album, and I highly recommend going through this one a few times because I think it's fairly slept on. Okay, enough of that one. Next, we are going for 1994's Euthanasia. This is a follow-up to 1992's Countdown to Extinction and a further departure and development on that album's relatively radio-friendly blend of heavy metal and lighter rock elements. I do think that they really stacked the A-side of this album quite a bit with massive tracks like Reckoning Day, Train of Consequences, A Tout Le Monde, dominating the first half of this album, but that's not to say that the B-side is bad either. Blood of Heroes all the way through the end of the album, while not the most memorable or lofty tracks in the catalog, are still incredibly admirable songs and overall excellent deeper cuts. I think for this album I'm pretty partial to Addicted to Chaos, Elysian Fields, and The Killing Road, and the title track of Euthanasia, one of the best songs in my opinion of their 90s era. I do appreciate the feedback and acknowledgement that this album has been receiving over the past few years too. I don't think that this album was ever really hated, but I sure do see it panned a lot in favor of some of their thrashier material. And while it may not be as intensely iconic as those albums, I think that this album is iconic in its own right. Okay, for this next one, I think this is going to maybe cause a little bit of a stir in the comments, but next up on the list is 2007's United Abominations. I will absolutely admit that this is a bias. This is the first Megadeth album that I ever owned. I blasted through this thing like when I was still using a Sony Walkman CD player. I think not soon after I picked up a copy of the 2005 compilation Greatest Hits Back to the Start, both of which I still own to this day. This album really solidified the return of Megadeth. There was talk after The System Has Failed about finally disbanding the group, but no, they kept on going, and what we got I consider a pretty brilliant album. And don't get me wrong, it's got some flaws. There are some lyrical blunders and cliches here, but the material is mostly very solid. I think hands down the track Washington Is Next might be one of the top 10 tracks in their entire catalog for me. And the riffs on this album are fantastic. I mean, the guitar work on the title track or on Gears of War, it's catchy and it's heavy. There are moments here where like the chug heavy writing does begin to poke its head into the room, but it's still like in enough variation in the writing that there's not too much that's obnoxious or too obvious. And I know on Gears of War, the intro and sort of bridge section of the track is a little bit goofy, but the chorus for this track is killer and the lyrics are just like, Blessed Be the Dead and Play for Blood also land really well here, with a lot of the songs here, like these, kind of feeling like a development or an adjustment on the material from The System Has Failed to more suitably fit the Megadeth name a little bit more comfortably. The re-recording of A Tout Le Monde here with Lacuna Coil singer Christina Scabia, while in my opinion inferior to the Euthanasia version, is still quite good. The last three tracks on the album, America Stan, You're Dead, and Burnt Ice, are a fantastic set of album closers. It's really really just one incredibly heavy song after the other, though You're Dead does do a little bit more of like a swingy thing. I do really feel that this album, while having some particularly awkward lyrics at times, also has some of the best lyric work in their later era catalog. I mean, it's a very hit and miss project, but the stuff that works is killer. And hey, we're into the top 5, which means we are getting pretty early into the catalog. For number 5, we're going with 1988's So Far, So Good, So What. This is, of course, the peak of the band's heroin use, and man, you can really hear it on this album. I would almost argue that this is the heaviest Megadeth album in terms of a pure level of hate and brutality that's just sort of packed into this thing. From the very first moments of Into the Lungs of Hell, a crushing instrumental track that kicks off this record. There's a sense on this album that Megadeth are here to just kind of destroy as much as possible. These songs are intense, they are heavy, they deal with some incredibly dark and personal themes. And yet there's still this angle of the songs just kind of being a bit sloppy, but ultimately I think that that is an okay thing. Honestly, this is another album that I think that the 2004 remasters did an injustice to. I would highly recommend the original Paul Lonnie mix of this album if you can get your hands on one. It's a far more devastating sound that fits a lot better with the generally more punk-heavy style that this album lands on. I think the biggest highlights on this album for me are the track Mary Jane, Hook and Mouth, and of course one of the best songs Dave Mustaine ever wrote, In My Darkest Hour. Despite this being the least focused of the early albums, the energy is still there. Dave sounds absolutely vicious on this album. There's some incredibly creative guitar work that plays off of these simpler rhythm grooves. Anyway, I generally think most of this album is pretty stellar. Alright, up next we've got the band's debut album, 1985's Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. I know that people like to endlessly shit on this album's less than ideal original mix, and there's that story about how the album was made on a budget of $8,000, which was immediately cut in half by the amount of drugs that the band bought. But even still, the way that this album did end up coming together after all of that is nothing short of a miracle that it turned out as well as it did. While I wouldn't say it's Megadeth's heaviest, I would say it's them at their most aggressive. The murder-suicide drama of Last Rites, Love to Death kicks off this album with like a light piano track that quickly delves into the story of a man killing this woman who he cannot be parted with. He views this woman as an angel, so he kills her and then kills himself, damning himself to torment in hell. But when he gets there, he finds that she is there too, finding out that this woman was cheating on him the whole time. It's a little bit juvenile, but it's still a gruesome and fantastic album opener. I also love the title track, Killing Is My Business, which is about a hitman and the general ins and outs of death dealers for hire. The Skull Beneath the Skin sheds some light on the creation of the band's mascot, Vic Rattlehead. Rattlehead, of course, is a headbanger's anthem. Chosen Ones tells a story of monster hunters. Looking Down the Cross tells a dramatic retelling of the crucifixion, presumably of Christ. Mechanics is, of course, the band's first major hit that would be reworked by Metallica into the Four Horsemen. And of course, there's the Lee Hazelwood cover of These Boots Are Made for Walking, which is still pretty hard to find a physical copy of, as Megadeth got sued in the 90s for this cover, which they never actually had permission to use. All of these songs are really raw and at some points a little bit amateurish, but there was a lot to prove, and I think that this is a great start. I do think my favorite track has got to be Looking Down the Cross. It may be in my top 5, in fact, but the way that that song is formatted is so ahead of its time, it easily could have been on Peace Sells. Okay guys, we're on to number 3 with 1992's Countdown to Extinction. This is the finest balancing act that the band have had between thrash and a more viable, more commercial sound that the band would head towards after this point. But in this album we get some of the band's most solid hits: Skin of My Teeth, Symphony of Destruction, Sweating Bullets, and the other slightly less big hits here are all high-tier work. This album also features some of Mustaine's smartest writing on the lyrical side of things. Songs like Architecture of Aggression and Foreclosure of a Dream become a little bit more in-depth politically. Title track Countdown to Extinction is a monumental song about how man will eventually destroy and consume its environment till the only thing left to eat is other men. Kind of like a forced, the most dangerous game situation. The highlight tracks for me on this one are obviously Symphony, This Was My Life, High Speed Dirt, Captive Honor, and Ashes in Your Mouth. Okay, we're into the top 2. This is the highest tier stuff, and honestly, you guys knew what they were gonna be. Number 2 is 1986's Peace Sells, but who's buying? This sophomore album really cements Megadeth not only as a serious project, but as a well-deserving contender for one of the greatest thrash bands of all time. From the iconic orange album art by Ed Repka to the instantly recognizable tone that starts off the album on Wake Up Dead, this album is so very close to masterpiece material. The title track Peace Sells, I would argue, has one of, if not the most recognizable bass line of all time. I think personally my favorite track on this album is the final song, My Last Words. An absolutely explosive explosive finale to this album, and I love the final guitar solo and the call and response of, "You next victim! You next to die!" The whole thing is anthemic. It may actually be my favorite Megadeth track, but as for overall quality, I think the undisputed top of the tops is 1990's Rust in Peace. And don't get me wrong, over the years, Peace Sells and Rust in Peace have kind of swapped places for me multiple times, and it's mostly because they are just so damn close to each other on this pinnacle of thrash metal. There's this really great Onion article that I see pop up once in a while that's entitled "Humanity's Still Producing Art, as though Megadeth's Rust in Peace doesn't already exist." And I know it's satire, but it really does kind of sum up my feelings for this album. While I do obviously think there are better albums out there, this, in my opinion, is the absolute peak of thrash metal. The fact that thrash metal has even made as much of a comeback as it has, to me, is a little bit surprising because it will never be better than this. Rust in Peace is the greatest thrash metal album of all time, and in a genre that is so insistent on being incestuous and being so rooted in not innovating, I personally believe it'll remain that way. And you know what? That may end up being the hottest take in this entire video. I don't think I really need to go through the tracks for this one. If you've made it this far into this video, it's likely that you know what I'm talking about here already, but if you don't, and you haven't listened to this album, what the hell are you doing? Put on Rust in Peace right now. Anyway, that was Megadeth from Worst to Best. I do really hope you all enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed writing it. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a ton. And finally, check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.